And hello there to everybody who's out there, or indeed anybody who's out there. And welcome to the Friday Treat, the picked webinar. And this one's going to be very interesting and very informative. And that's mostly because I won't be doing most of the talking. So who's joined us so far? Who do we have out there? Who has taken the risk of joining me on this rather special day for myself, which I won't go into. But there's Marlene. Good afternoon to you. And yes, indeed, a remarkable woman. Thank you. Dennis knows why it's a special day. Thank you very much, Dennis. And here I am, in spite of the day that's in it, here ready and willing to serve you and to give you the pearls of my wisdom and the sweat of my brow. So I hope you all enjoy being here. As usual, a very gracious thank you to the Allegheny Foundation for their very gracious sponsorship of the webinars. As I told you before, Allegheny Foundation have sponsored us for the year, and which has made life a lot easier for us, and we're able to up the quality and indeed the output. We can now be seen on our very own YouTube channel, where you not only get the webinars themselves, but all the alerts and all the information about upcoming webinars. And we do humbly request that you don't merely look at the YouTube webinar, but that you subscribe to the YouTube for us. You can subscribe to PIC's YouTube channel on our website. Most of these things are very easy. People keep saying, how can I do it? Go to the front page of the website and you'll find buttons to push. And even I, in my dotage, at the vast age that I have now achieved, even I can push those buttons. So you can push your subscribe button, you can push your donation button, and of course, we would always encourage you to push that one as well, because every donation, as I keep saying, matters. David, hello from sunny Stratford. Well, actually, David, it's actually sunny in Pittsburgh. And it's sunny for the first time in days. We've had miserable cloud cover and some miserable rain as well. But today, for my birthday, thank you, Marlene, for my birthday, the sun has come out, the temperature has gone up, it's not raining, it's a glorious day here in Pittsburgh. Hello, Helen. Special day indeed. You make it so for me. I promise you, Helen, and thank you for being with us. So on this rather glorious and very special day, we're going to deal with a rather glorious and very special subject, as you can see by the banner. And this is a continuation of the last few webinars that we've been presenting on the topic of the Harlem Renaissance. And so today's subject is really part. I talked last week with Tommy about the effect that the Harlem Renaissance had, the long-term effect it had on art in America, on poetry and theater and dance and all the other aspects of it, and the visual arts. And today, really, we're taking up that theme by discussing somebody who is the classic representation of the effect that that Renaissance had. And we will do that in 2 or 3 minutes' time. We'll let the latecomers come late and join us at the table. If anybody else there wants to say hello. Yes, James from White Oak. Another regular, James. Welcome. Good you're there. Hello, Wayne at Prime Stage. Prime Stage, another wonderful theatre company of Pittsburgh. And thank you very much, Wayne, for the birthday greeting. Grace from Dublin, bright evening in Dublin. I hope I'm having a very busy birthday today because we had recordings to do, and I had, shall we say, my car had an altercation a couple of weeks back, so I had to go and pick that up from the hospital, and then we got to this. So I've been having a busy old day for my birthday, but I do promise you that when it's all over, hello, it's Jamie one. When it's all over this afternoon, I shall be settling down with a nice bottle of something red, and celebrating quietly and humbly by myself. because we'll have a big party in the summer. Anyway, Michelle from Shady Side, here again, always here. Bless you. Thank you for being with us. It's lovely the number of regulars now who tune into this. I know not everybody can make it every week, but at least you know that you can watch the webinar whether you're here live or not, because it will always be on the YouTube channel. All the old webinars are there, and you can subscribe, and it's free. When we say subscribe, we usually mean give us some money, not to subscribe. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, get to know about us, see all the stuff we talked about in the past, share that with your friends. And if you or your friends want to use these webinars, some teachers are using them. Let's teach you so. This is a service for you, and it's free. If, on the other hand, you want to send us a small donation, you're very welcome to do so. But there's no obligation. You're not obliged to do that. But if you feel the urge, push the donation button on the website and send us a few dollars or a few euro or zlotys or whatever pounds, whatever you have, whatever your currency is. We'll take all currencies, including Bitcoin. Hello, Shelley.
Will not take Bitcoin.
We won't take. I've just been reliably informed by my general operations manager that we will not take Bitcoin. But I personally will take Bitcoin if anybody wants to send me any. But the company isn't set up to deal with Bitcoin. We're very technologically minded, but not quite that good. Otherwise, we'd be going mining for Bitcoins. Shelley, I said hello. Yes, welcome back. And Greg, late but not unregarded. Glad you're with us, and thanks for coming. We don't mind if you turn up late. That's why we always wait 3 or 4 minutes. We know you may have to park or something, or refresh your cup of coffee, or have a moment with yourself in a small room in the house. So all of those things we take into account before we begin. Now, I think it's time that we begin. So the subject of today's webinar, if I do this little list, as you know, my great source of wisdom is the mighty wiki. But just reading, I was just enthralled reading this. An American poet, memorist, civil rights activist, published 7 autobiographies, 3 books of essays, several books of poetry, is credited with a list of plays, movies, television shows spanning over 50 years, received dozens of awards and more than 50 honorary degrees, and 7 autobiographies, the first of which just brought her life, her fascinating life, just up to the age of 17. And that was called by a title that just about everybody who ever heard of her knows. And many people know the phrase, even if they don't know the person. I know why the caged bird sings. I refer, of course, to the remarkable, I would say, unique Maya Angelou. And to talk with me about, because I am no authority, and as I say, to follow up on the 2 programs that we did on the Harlem Renaissance, where I mentioned the fact that in the last program, we discussed to a degree what the effect of the Renaissance was, what the long-term effect, how it changed American culture and American art. And this week, talking on the topic of Maya Angelou, she is, I would say, the perfect personification of the result of that entire movement that came through the Harlem Renaissance. And to discuss that with me, I would like to introduce my guest, a Pittsburgher, an actor, a director, and somebody who is a self-confessed passionate exponent of the work of Maya Angelou, Montez Freeman. Montez, welcome.
Hi.
Glad you're there to join us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as well. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And on your birthday, that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know I don't look a day over 35, but
No, you don't.
But so to begin this, there's Ken's joined us. Happy Donut Day. As I was saying in the introduction, this one of the reasons I'm thrilled that we can do this and that you've joined us, because I know that you spend a lot of your own time both working on and appreciating and studying the work of Maya Angelou. how right am I in saying that? That's a very leading question, but how right am I in saying that she is a perfect personification of the effect that the Harlem Renaissance created?
I think you're pretty on point with that. I think that in the time which Dr. Angelo was born, around that time, that's when the Harlem Renaissance was really flourishing and at its forefront in culture. And so, of course, over the years, I think that she's a result of that, because that Renaissance allowed the world to, be exposed to Black art, the written word, visual art, singing, fashion, all of those things. And so, of course, it trickled down. But I also believe that Dr. Angelo was definitely a challenge to the Harlem Renaissance and some of its conservative thinking that permeated within members of the group, like Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson. So around the time when I believe she became to the forefront as a writer, she really was part of the Black arts movement, and which was developed after the assassination of Malcolm X. And people such as Dr. Angelou and Amiri Baraka and James Baldwin, they really worked together to write about empowerment through creativity. And they were very assertive, and some would say radical, and some would say mean, and some would say loud, and brought a sort of a different movement with their work that was a little bit more purposeful, a little bit more risky than I think what the Harlem Renaissance offered. But that's what should happen. I think that because of the Renaissance, because of that moment of getting people to look, we then had they had our attention. They had the world's attention, so that people like Dr. Angelou and James Baldwin could come in and say those deep truths that they experienced, that they witnessed with their own eyes, and that they eventually turned into creativity.
Because that's one of the great truths about any movement, isn't it? Once it begins, it's not static, it's a snowball. And once it starts rolling down the hill, it's going to get bigger and bigger and wider and beyond the expectations of the initial, because there was no real, in that sense, single activist that created the Harlem Renaissance. It was something that emerged and evolved. So you might say this new phase of it, and as you say, James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and others, it's not so much they turned direction, but they took it to its next conclusion, would you say?
Absolutely. They were growing with the world. And it's not that, of course, the issues of the world were certainly happening in the early 20s into the, late 20s to early 30s of the Renaissance, of course. But it was definitely, not publicized, I think, as much as it was, 2 decades later or so, as to where you could literally see on the injustice on your television screen. You could hear it, through the radio and things of that nature. So it grew with the world. And I think that there were certainly African-American writers who didn't go down that path, who, stayed with a more conservative view. And they didn't necessarily, their art didn't grow with the times. Their art wasn't necessarily what the younger people wanted to hear and wanted to groove to, because they more so, I think, were hearkening back to a time in which Black people weren't able to fully say their feelings in this creative way. And so I think that Dr. Angelou and Baldwin had to grow and had to sort of lead with their heart when it came to their art. For sure.
Well, also, I mean, you mentioned a thing there which brings a thought into my mind that, when we look at that period later in terms of the Renaissance and the beginning of what we might call the more modern period, the 60s,
yes,
was the first, because you had a war that was going on that people for the first time could watch literally live on television. That was Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody had ever been, any time that people had watched film of war, it had been edited, it was under control, it was newsreel. But suddenly activity like the Vietnamese War was happening in your kitchen, in your den, in your sitting room, live. And the same was true of such things as race riots, the reporting of, and you mentioned Malcolm X. You know, the murder of Malcolm X was something that was suddenly there in your living room. It was changing people's not necessarily changing their attitudes, but certainly changing their awareness to what was going on, which must have had a profound effect on writers, and the fact that they were no longer simply reporting through their writing what had happened. They were commenting through their writing on what was happening. Must have been a huge sea change in the way that they thought.
Absolutely. And they, and they didn't just live in their own bubble. They infiltrated politics. They infiltrated the government. They would go and sit in, and they would, hold sit-ins during different hearings. They really made sure that it didn't just live in a space of their art being viewed, that their art actually became chants, that it became part of the underground of the movement. And they weren't precious about their celebrity. They were on the, they were in the protests, they were on the streets, they were in the jails, they were, making the signs. They were out there on the front lines using their celebrity, using their voice, because I mean, let's be honest, nobody, they weren't necessarily household names at that point. So they in turn were still fighting for the careers in which they wanted. But more than the career, I think that they wanted, they more so wanted the lifestyle that was appropriate and that should have been given to African Americans and other oppressed people during that time. So I think that, I look at it as sort of, there are people who are catapulted into stardom and into the spotlight, and there are some people who, are looking for it and searching for it. And I think these people were just trying to tell their truths and just looking for avenues and outlets to do so. And then their truth aligned with the social movement and the civil rights movement that was happening at the time. So there was no way to separate it. There was no way to ignore it. And I think that we are actually seeing a resurgence of that happening today, where I think that no one, you can't necessarily sit down as a Black writer, it seems, and to not, be able to disassociate yourself with what's happening in the world today and using your art to turn the dial or to open, someone's eyes or to challenge the system of oppression.
Which is, I suppose, where I want to drift us towards, that as a writer, as a poet, as a playwright, as any kind of writer, your writing is only as true as the life you lead, as if it must be a reflection on what you know, what you see, what you feel, what you think. And if we want to talk about a poet reflecting on that, we just have to look at the Biden inauguration and that remarkable piece of poetry.
Yes.
Which was a superb reflection on, I suppose, where we are today. In the same way that Angelou and Baldwin were talking about where they were at that time and their reflections on it. Let's talk a little bit about her, because I mentioned in the introduction, I mean, huge, 7 autobiographies, books of essays, several books of poetries, plays, movies, TV shows, 50 honorary doctorates, awards. She was a remarkable human being.
Yeah, I don't know who is more decorated. I really feel like we should find out who has more, And I mean, and then you think about the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Pulitzer Prize nominations, Tony Award nominations. It's like the list continues to go on and on and on. And she didn't just, dabble in these different areas and disciplines. She rose to the very top of what they represented on the biggest stages that they could offer. So to see a woman who could pivot on on a dime, and not just pivot and, I'm going to ease into this, but to do it with courage, to do it with strength, and then to succeed, it's really remarkable. And when you look at her upbringing, it really, you try to pinpoint the spot in which someone, gains that strength. And I think that she does a wonderful job in saying there is no moment in which you become strong, in which you become daring, in which you decide to, enact courage. It's a conglomerate of your experiences and of you wanting more and not accepting what's put in front of you. And I think I can relate to that. I like to do a lot of things. I don't necessarily just want to do one thing. And she was a huge inspiration, is a huge inspiration for me to not only just go into a different discipline, but to do the research and the work inside of it, and to have the respect to be first a student and then grow to be a teacher.
She had, I mean, I totally agree with you, because I think any artist who doesn't do other things is not really able to be a representative of that marvelous thing called life.
Yes.
I remember when I left theatre school, I wanted to be an actor. That was all I wanted to be, just be an actor. Famous actor, paid lots of money, famous actor. That was it. And I've done 95 other things throughout the course of my life. But that's what's taught me more about how to be an actor, is the range of things. Even being a director has taught me more about being an actor. So all of those things. She, in her very young days, she had an extraordinary range of activities. Again, she was a cook, nightclub performer, sex worker, it says here. She was also in the cast of Porgy and Bess, world tour of that.
Yes.
Which is something I never knew.
Yeah.
But also, it says here, Southern Christian Leadership Conference coordinator, correspondent in Egypt and Ghana during decolonization. So when you say she really did go into each of these things seriously, she really did. Because you might say that her experience of life literally ran the gamut from lowest of the low to most achiever of achievements. Her background in life was vast.
It was. And, when you think about it, her background in life was basically the catapult of her ultimate fame and success around the age of 40 years old. Had she not really lived as I think as eclectically and as hard as she did, I don't think that Cage Bird, and granted, Cage Bird was based off of her, very formative years, but I don't know if she had the tenacity if she didn't have that tenacity to live in that way, that her book would have catapulted and sort of held all the gems that would have been necessary for it to become the phenomenon that it is. And as you mentioned, from what I've read and watched, she, really credited herself as being a dancer first. She loved to dance. And so she, went into the world to figure out how to do that. At one point, she and Alvin Ailey started a small dance team, I think it's not called that.
Good title.
They want me to come outside, but they started a small dance team called, I think, Al and Rita. And, so she really did immerse herself in many different avenues of art. And when you think about Porgy and Bess, she took on that. She went out for that gig because she wanted to see the world. And that was a way, that tour allowed her to see Europe. And she would spend time in different countries and pick up the language very quickly before moving on to another country or another city. And she would then, come back to America sort of very, learned and experienced. But she had a gift for memorization and a gift for absorbing, which I think she did pick up being a young child, through her mutism.
Yeah. It's all sort of because it's interesting. You make the point that she was 40 something when she became, I don't want to use the word famous, but when she became seriously regarded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so people might think from that she was a late starter, but it's like she was using those years to accrue the knowledge and the wisdom that would turn her into the poet she was.
Absolutely. And before Cage Bird, she certainly was more so, she would tell people, I'm a poet, I'm a playwright, I'm a playwright. I'm not necessarily one who wants to sit down and write a novel, especially about her life. So she was pretty reticent to doing so because she wanted to live in the creative aspects of her mind and not necessarily in the, the memory part. So how that came about was through a bit of a dare, but I don't know if we want to get into all that now or a little later. But you're right to sort of have all of that experience behind her. I think just propelled her strength, to be honest, in that book. After living for 40 years and after having so many experiences, after being so close to icons in the civil rights movement who were gunned down and taken away, and having to be around and still live with the remnants of that certainly took a toll on her. And when it came to Caged Bird, she didn't set out necessarily to write that story. And it was a bit of a dare after she was getting over the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King.
How would you say, because the assassination of Dr. King was, you might say, a seminal moment in the lives of so many artists, and not just American artists, but particularly African American artists. How would you say that in terms, because one always looks at sort of the chronology of the development of an artist. I mean, it's the way we do it. I mean, we look at Shakespeare and we look at the periods of his writing. We do the same with everybody. Right. But how, I mean, it sounds like a trite question, but how significant was King's assassination to her? Was it, would you describe that as a political turning point as much as an artistic turning point?
Oh, yes. I think it was definitely a political turning point, an artistic turning point, a personal turning point as well. And I think it was compounded upon the fact that a few years before that, Malcolm X was assassinated, and she met Dr. Angelou was living in Ghana at the time, working everywhere at the university, working for the newspaper, doing everything there, and really being a part of the African American expatriate culture that was in Ghana. And Malcolm X came to visit, and that's how they first met. And so from his visit, she was really inspired to go back to America to assist him as he was leaving the Nation of Islam to begin his own organization. And so when she came back to America to, work with Brother Malcolm, he was assassinated shortly after. So that was a blow. And then, of course, she had been, in close relationships, not close relationship, but close ties with Dr. King. And then in 1968, when he was assassinated, she went into a depression and actually went back into a bout of mutism. And it was Jimmy Baldwin. I'm going to keep saying Jimmy Walker for whatever reason, who has nothing to do with this, not that I know of. But she, like a good friend, like a brother, Jimmy Baldwin came to her house and said, "Hey, sis, you have to, pick yourself up. You have to get it together." And he took her to a party of a famous cartoonist whose name at the moment is skipping my mind, but he took her to a party Jules Pfeiffer. Yes. And this was in 1968. They went to a dinner party, and, and so Baldwin started coaxing her to tell some stories about Stamps, Arkansas. And Stamps was a place where she grew up with her paternal grandmother. And in Stamps, she quipped, segregation is so rampant in Stamps that, Black people can't even eat vanilla ice cream. And so therefore, it broke the room up, and she started to tell more stories. And through her oration, that was the beginning of her healing. The next day, Pfeiffer's wife called Robert Loomis at Random House and said, "You have to listen to this woman. You have to get to know her." And he's like, "Yes, I know. Everyone has a story." That's wonderful. He met her and, of course, fell in love, as many people did, with her and her talent. But she was reticent. He called her about 6 times in order, to say, "Can you please write the story of your life?" And it wasn't until the last time he called to say, "You know what? I'm not going to call you anymore. It's just as well. You don't want to do this because, writing an autobiography as literature is just not, it's impossible. It'll never sell." And to know someone like Dr. Angelou, who I do not know, but to know her character, to dare her in that sense was just the beginning. That was the spark that she needed. So in London, and over the course of about 2 years, she wrote the book, and of course, with help of editors and so forth, and really that helped pull her out of that place of deep despair of watching people who were only working for the right, the good, people who were only in the world to push for a more just world, to be taken away so callously. It played a huge part on everyone, but for someone who knew them and who studied with them and who worked with them and who was walking alongside them, that was a terrible blow. But she, of course, turned her tragedy into art, as many artists do, but certainly as many African Americans do.
Yeah. I suppose the next question is, because you mentioned the process of writing the autobiography, the initial, as a healing process for herself. 7 she wrote. Would you look at those books? I mean, if somebody was saying, well, which one do I read? I suppose all of them, because you want to read the chronology. But also, would you think of those as autobiographies or as literature?
I personally look at them as literature. I think that, there's certainly autobiographies, but I think the way in which she was able to capture, of course, her own feelings and her own, mindset, but also the people around her, proved that she was drawing inspiration from her grandmother, from her uncle, from her mother and father. These people were inspiring her to create these, not characters, but to really produce a well-rounded example of who these people were. But the height of her language, she was, she loved Shakespeare. She loved the classics. So that, I think, is what turns it into literature. She tells her story, but it's not in common speak, in my opinion. I think it's not necessarily difficult to understand, but you certainly have to pay attention to. You have to appreciate the choice of language, because it's not by happenstance. So for me, I think it's literature. I think that throughout all 7 of them, she takes you on a journey through her personal life, but she also takes you on a journey through her artistic life and through her perils of trying and not succeeding, or trying and really succeeding, and thinking of how to include other people in that success. Now, as opposed to, answering the question of like, which one should you read? I personally have read the first one and the last one. The last one, I think, is called Mom, Me, and Mom, which is about her relationship with her mother, which was very, a little unconventional. And and when you read Cage Bird, it's like you get a sense of it. But this book really filled in a lot of the gaps that made you wonder, what was going on here, what was happening. And I think it took her a lifetime, in a sense, to really understand her mother. And so therefore, for that to be the last book, I think that the bookends is where you can start, and then, start to meet in the middle along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I confess, I've only read Cage Bird. That's the only one I've read. But I really think I sort of asked the question because, and I'm delighted the way you phrased it, because she was a classicist. Yes. In the sense that she loved language and the use of language and the precision. I mean, any poet must adore the precision of language. But to my mind, from what I've read about the series of autobiographies, and as I say, I've only actually fully read one of them, it is that she is not merely telling her story, but she is telling a story.
Yes.
She's telling the story. In the classic sense, that any of Shakespeare's plays are it's not just a play about Richard III, it's a play about gaining power, using power, and losing power. And it's true not only of its time, but for all time, which is my definition of classic.
Yes.
And I think, from what I understand about Maya Angelou, is that she has written something that is true of its time and for all time, because she is writing the story. And when you say you could almost start at the beginning and read to the end, or start at the end and work back to the beginning, or start at both ends and come to the middle, that's a great truth about great literature. that it almost doesn't matter which way you read it, because you're reading aspects not just of a life, but of life.
Yes.
Is that what makes her a poet for you?
Oh, what makes her a poet for me? I think that absolutely makes her a poet for me. It's that, like you said, that precision, the surprise to listen to a poem and to hear the word mastodon, inside of it. It's it's always the element of surprise. And I find that when I read her poetry, I always, as an actor, we try to read and we think we know what the next line is going to be, because we want to think that we are attuned enough with this person's rhythm and knowing, okay, I know where this line will end. And you are always surprised. You're always surprised where it slips into something sweet in the middle of maybe a rather daunting story, or when there's a slip of blame or shame to be placed on a person or on a group or an experience that pops up in the middle, or a question. She plays with these rhetorical questions within her poetry as well, which allows like it's almost like she's asking you or daring you to ask yourself or to ask someone else. So her poetry, I think, is just full of surprises. And there's a poem that I can't think of the name of, but she talks about the laugh in which African Americans, especially women, have to use, and that laugh masks their actual feelings. And in the middle of this laughter, she's performing this piece, just tears start to come down her eyes, down her face. It was never just words for her. These were experiences. These words were wrapped around people's lives. These words were words that people, some of the last words that people heard before they died, before they were murdered. So she turned all of that, those scars into art, but she put it on a pedestal, but not high enough for us not to reach, but certainly, high enough for us to attain to want to obtain to.
Which is, I mean, again, I come back to my tedious definition of what is classic. And that is classic literature, because, as you say, it's not so high that we can't reach it. It is elevated.
Yes.
Because it's elevating us as we approach it. But it's about us. Now, I use that to being terribly conscious of the fact that it is about the African American experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also greater than that. It is about human experience. And that's what elevates it even beyond that. It is about all of us, because there is nobody on this planet, nobody, who at some point or other has not felt the emotions and the stresses and the strains and the joys and the happiness of being who they are, and being punished for being who they are. It is a thing that, if only we could all recognize in each other, that all experiences are similar. And that's why I think from and I am no expert by any means, but from what I perceive and understand from her writing is understanding, and you said it, where she's talking to you through her writing.
Yes.
I read it and she's asking me questions.
Absolutely.
And to my mind, that makes her quite a remarkable writer.
Yes.
Quite a remarkable writer. She, just like Shakespeare, she has this brilliant ability to transcend the ordinary and to elevate us to something special, all of us.
Absolutely. I think that at the core of her writing is humanity. Yeah. And that also was part of the core of her anger. And I say anger because I don't think that we should stray away from the fact that she didn't deny her anger, that she lived in those moments of being fed up, of the way in which humans were being treated and the way in which humans were being demoralized in art and in life and in everyday circumstances. So I think that her goal was to unite, of course, but also to unite to open our hearts to understand that we're only always sitting across from another human who very well could have some of the same experiences, but we have allowed ourselves to put up these barriers to say, well, because you look a certain way, because you dress a certain way, because you act a certain way, we can't possibly be connected. And that happens internally within the African American community. I mean, she grew up in her paternal side were rather dark-skinned African Americans, and her maternal side were rather lighter skinned African Americans. So she lived within that duality of the worlds in which they both were accustomed to, and the worlds in which they both were, privileges and benefits and consequences from. And being in that middle, she and her brother as the conduit between the two, I think that she really just wanted everyone to realize, we have to work together, and not that we are all the same. But if we really look at our lives, we can see that there are many similarities that if we would just hone in on, it would allow grace. It would allow us to respect one another in a deeper way. So I fully 100% agree. And I think that one story that I think it, sums it up a little bit. I mean, you look at one of the most prolific people in, modern history, Oprah Winfrey, and, reading her book, it was the first time she read about another young child going through sexual abuse, and a young Black woman going through sexual abuse that she experienced. So here's a person who felt, alone for all intents and purposes. And now here's a book of someone's experiences saying you are not alone. Similarly, former President Bill Clinton read her book and connected to the book because he grew up not far from Stamps, Arkansas, and his grandfather, just like her grandmother, owned a general store that serviced the public. Now, in this store, personally, I believe that is where Dr. Angelou really learned about the differences in humans and also the similarities. When you're in a store, I feel as though you see people at a moment. I always say this, if you work at a coffee shop, you see people right before they need their fix. And so I think that when you work in a general store that offers needs to people, you see people at their lowest, possibly begging. You see people excited. You see people who are not native to your town, who are passing through. You see poor whites, you see rich, affluent Black people. You have a very, diverse understanding that all of these people, regardless of their differences, socioeconomic backgrounds, race, they need the same thing, sustenance to live.
Yeah.
They have to go to the same place to obtain it, use the same currency to get it. And therefore, if we all need the same thing to survive and to thrive and to live, how can we put up these barriers and pretend that we can't be, gracious enough to give what we know that we need ourselves? So I think that her formative years were just so transformative in a sense for her in seeing the world. And then you look at someone, a man who grew up not far from that area, who became president of the United States, who I think also had those same experiences of looking at the fact that everyone needs the same things in order to survive and to live. And if you deny people that, then what type of humans and what type of humanity are we really cultivating?
Yeah, it's actually, I always said that when you mentioned, working in the grandfather's store, and you see humanity in all its aspects. I always said that I learned more about acting as a barman than I ever did in a theater school, but because you were watching humanity face to face at their most needy and the most vulnerable and the most satisfied. So, what would you say? We talked about that she was part of what we might call the inheritance from the Harlem Renaissance, that this movement that grew out of it, and with a much more activist, African American centered thing, people like James Baldwin as well as herself. But how would you say that she will serve? I mean, it's a big question. Where's the next stage from her? Because we know where Shakespeare led. We know where various poets have led thinking and various, because of the nature of their personalities. Do you see a line of development from that?
Oh, I certainly do. I think that, her works have definitely garnered, stage productions and movies. But, yes, I do think it lives on. And I think that it will live on. And I think that it will be inspirational to generations. But I don't know. I kind of also have a strange thought that she was here for a reason and she did everything while she was here. And for those who were able to experience it, I think it was for them. It was for us. And now, yes, we can watch videos and we can see, we can read the materials and they will live on and on and on. But to live during the time in which Dr. Angelou lived, I think is so precious and special in and of itself, because it's through experiences. It's through that first moment. And she was a tangible being. She was a tangible person. She was of the people. So there have been people who have been literally, graced by her presence that take that with them and pass it on. I grew up in Baltimore, and so my teachers were very much, I feel like some couple of them were a couple ex Black Panthers to a degree, and definitely activists. So we weren't leaving the school without learning about Dr. Maya Angelou and everyone else who, during that time, who encouraged African Americans to live and thrive. I hope that young people will tune in and take into account the ground in which she's paved for us to walk on. I hope that the next generation will understand that people who now are easily able to slip into the spotlight or easily able to be an activist, maybe they don't have as much to lose as what she and her contemporaries had to lose. And hopefully that garners strength. But it's really up to us. It's really up to situations like this. It's really up to us having the conversations about these people to spark going back to research and to read and to understand not just their life, but how they progressed art. Because while I think that I understand her hesitancy in a sense of wanting to write down her life story and then seeing how it became so big and how it flourished into many people's hearts and minds. I'm sure she was very, very grateful for that. But her life was not her life became her art, but her life was not her art. And so me personally, I'm more so invested in looking at the plays that she wrote, looking at, the words that she wrote, and looking at the movies that she directed and seeing what her style was and seeing how she included poetry even in cinematography, which is there. So I'm interested in researching those aspects. She gave us her life. We understand, what she went through, but I don't think that we should forget the art that came from it.
It's interesting, just following that thought up, as you were saying it, it just occurred to me because, I consider now at my advanced years, I'm blessed by the fact that I certainly lived through one of the greatest decades in history. In terms of that decade, we all loved nature, we loved the earth, we loved music, we loved each other, and we had flowers in our hair. And we used noxious substances as well. Not that I ever did. But the 60s was a remarkable time.
Yes.
And the 60s was sort of plunk in the middle from the late 40s through to the 90s. Was a very unique time. The time of the baby boomers. We were born after not one, but two world wars that devastated the world, not just Europe. And the notion of peace and loving one another and reconciliation and all of that was all over the place, everywhere. Everybody wanted it. So you had this strange 50-year period, the growth of the baby boomers, where love, peace, and concord were everywhere except with regard to race.
Yes.
That battle was still being fought.
Right.
And so to my mind, that's why I'm intrigued by the way you put it. Her art, she was not a poet who happened to be alive and live. She was a person who was alive and lived and fought and struggled and learnt, who then wrote it down
Yes.
as poetry, which makes, to my mind, an infinitely more. She wrote what she saw,
Mm-hmm.
rather than making something up.
Right.
All writers do that. You write what you see, but sometimes you write it as a mythological world with dragons and dark lords and strange rings, and sometimes you just write straight into the mind of the listener or the reader or the viewer if you're making a movie. And she seems to have done everything. I mean, I envy her for her energy more than anything else. But what she managed to achieve. Is that what makes, to my mind, that's what makes her classic? Because if it's true of its time, it will be true of all time.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right in that's what makes it classic. But she also, I think, was writing down, a world that she wanted to see. She had no problem saying, this is the world where we are now. And you have two choices. I think you can either, just accept it and roll over in defeat, or you can say, I see that, but I also see this. I also see this world. And that sort of manifestation of what life could be was placed inside of her and into her from her grandmother, Annie Henderson. And it was, she often regaled of times of having her hair being coiffed or cornrowed or braided, and her grandmother saying, you're going to go out into the world. You're going to be a preacher. You're going to be a teacher. You're going to teach everyone in the world. You're not an idiot. You're not dumb. These are the riches in which you'll have. So there was, and she even said to herself, she said, oh my goodness, my poor grandmother has lost her mind. She certainly doesn't know what she's talking about. But that manifestation, that affirmation of what's to come, I think that along with the faith in which she grew up in and grew up around was absolutely tantamount to her becoming the person that she is, because we are all, I think, here on the prayers and wishes of our grandparents, still thriving and pushing through, and their dreams for us. But, what they can see and what the generation before can see for us is not always linear. It's not always clear. And it took a lot of paths before she became that sort of reverent teacher to all of us. I grew up in the 90s. So my introduction to Dr. Angelou lived in, a combination of Sesame Street, hearing her on there singing and dancing on Sesame Street. Of course, President Clinton's inauguration, her poem there. And then in the movie Roots, in which she played the grandmother of Kunta Kinte. And that, even being a part of that moment, catapulted her into her life as an orator, going around the country and talking about the history that African Americans have lived through and the history of Africans and our journey from Africa to America and the ramifications of such. So that, it seemed like every step, not every step was the right step or a good step or the best step, but every step prepared and catapulted her into the next realm in which she just said, I'm here, let's take over, let's do it.
You mentioned faith. How important was faith to her? What would you describe her as a deeply religious person?
Well, I would describe her as a deeply spiritual person, for sure. I think that she learned enough of many different religions and cultures to, probably to not just subscribe to one. But I think she absolutely knew and understood that God is inside of us, that God loves all of us, that God is us, and if we pick up on that notion, then we in turn can't put our blame and can't put the shame on something that we can't see, but we in turn can put it into a tangible space where we can, through communication, through want, through love, through art, through singing, through crying, that we can work through those moments. So
okay,
I
want to just say to people, if you've got any questions or any comments, please put them up there, because we'd love to hear from you. This is clearly we could do 3 more of these, and we may. If you do have any, there's Richard there. Just read Cage Bird. I'm fascinated by Miss Angelou. I'm watching from Los Gatos, California. Hello. Cage Bird does seem to be the one that captures people's imagination, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And, for me, as a young, like I said, I grew up in Baltimore, so, we had to read it. But then as an adult, about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I don't know if it's been that long, about 4 or 5 years ago, I had the privilege of directing the stage adaptation of her novel for Prime Stage Theater Company. And it was one of those things where I was hesitant. I was hesitant about directing it because I personally felt as though a Black woman should be at the helm of telling that story. There were absolutely moments in which I could not relate to and never will be able to relate to. But yet there were characters and remnants and themes that I knew so personally and that I was excited to explore. And this production that was written, I believe, in 2004 and produced then was revamped with Book It Repertory Theater, I believe in Seattle, by Myra Platt and Malika Oyetimian. And it premiered there in 2003. And then again in 2017, after a few rewrites and structural changes. So by the time it got to us here in Pittsburgh and we were ready to put on the show, there was just this reverence that we all knew that we had to come into the room with. This respect. There was not a day in which we didn't sit around the table and read, because we knew that she wanted us to. If it was a matter of reading something of her work or reading something that would inspire the work, but we would sit around the table, we would read, we would commune. And that ensemble became a family. And I know people like to throw that around when it comes to theater. We all work together. We're a family. It was wonderful. We love one another. But I have never worked with another ensemble that was so close knit and tight and cared and stayed in contact with one another. That text thread has not died. It is still alive and well. But from that experience, what it did is it begat more work. It begat activism. We have people in the city, when I look at Brendan Pfeiffer and Malik Maad and Roxy Robinson, who have just catapulted in their careers after that production, because I think it gave all of us the courage to go out and try and to say, you know what, I'm going to do this. And not only am I going to do it, but I'm going to try to be the best in this genre that I can be.
Yeah.
And there was a moment in the show, if I have a little time to tell a story. There was a moment in the show in which during the graduation, in which the students began to sing the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And I told the cast, I said, listen, if we hit this right, everyone in the audience is going to stand up and they're going to join you. And they're like, okay. And so we get to that moment in the show, I believe it's opening night, and they start to cue up, the Lift Every Voice and Sing. Every Black person stood to their feet. Every white person looked around and immediately followed suit. They didn't know why. They didn't know what for, but they knew they should have stood. It was time to stand up and engage. I've never seen that happen in a theater before. Never seen a theater.
It's wonderful when that kind of thing does happen.
Mm-hmm.
That you suddenly realize that what theater is, that we have actually reached out to an audience and said, join us, because we are telling you a story that you are part of.
Right. And also putting in landmark moments in Black culture.
Yeah.
Of course, we're specific for her, but became universal for everyone else. That when you ignore those things that we take for granted, little moments and things of, no one will care if I add this in. It means a lot to people to be able to be seen and to have that representation. So there were many, many moments like that within the show. But it absolutely.
Wayne from Prime Stage has that question up. Can you share your experience of meeting her grandchildren when you directed the show?
That was, there are some things in life where you're like, that happened? That really went down like that? So kudos to Wayne for being able to pull that off and getting her grandchildren, her grandson and her great granddaughter, both came to see the show and were kind to the cast. And it was one of those moments where I didn't know how they would be. You know, I'm like, I'm not sure if they're going to like the direction, if they're going to like the show, if they're going to like what we've done to it, because I like to take liberties sometimes. And so, and you know, and I wasn't sure what their temperament would be as well, because, you know, I'm like, these are our grandchildren. And I know if my grandmother was Dr. Angela, I'd walk in the room, my shoulders, you know, to the sky. They were the most lovely, wonderful, gracious, exuberant people. And it all clicked. You saw the cast kind of just relax, because it's like, why wouldn't they be? They came from that stock. They came from the stock of someone who only reached back as they climbed, who only offered, you know, generosity and love first, unless you gave, you know, I imagine, unless you would give her a reason not to. And probably for the love that she was searching in her own life. It was so easy to give because she wanted to, you know, have that for herself. But to meet them and to chat with them, it was just a beautiful moment, because it really brought it full circle. And, you know, of course, everyone wants the adulation and the applause and the thank yous. But if we got, you know, panned reviews, and if no one came to see the show, it would have been worth it for that moment. And it was a bit nerve-wracking too, because my mother was there as well. And as a teenager performing, I used to do Maya Angelou in different shows that we would write and things like that. And it was, you know, more of a character spoof, all with respect, of course. But my mother, who was also, you know, a darer as well, she's like, I'm going to go over there and tell them you used to imitate her, you know, their grandmother. And so I'm literally like, don't do that, Mom. You know, but it was in the spirit of just, you know, she was like, you loved her as a kid. I want to let them know that. I'm like, I don't know if this is the right time to do something like that. But they were so personable and so lovely. And I think it was encouraging for the cast as well, because it was right at the onset of the show. I'm be honest, the opening night did not go as planned. There were glitches, there were issues, there were problems. But throughout all of that, they were so gracious, and they understood that the story at the forefront was what mattered, and the cast powered through all of that.
All right, listen, we're out of time, which I think is tragic, because I'd love to keep talking more. But we may come back to this later in the year. I know you are a busy person like me, but because finding dates where we can do stuff is always difficult. But I hope we can come back and have more conversation on this topic at some point later in the year. But in the meantime, Montez, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It was brilliant. It's great to see you. And, and take care in your current endeavors. And as I said, we're going to try and come back to that. In the meantime, everybody, thank you for being with us yet again. Now, as I keep telling you, Bloomsday is coming up, the day on the 16th of June when, in the imagination of James Joyce, one Leopold Bloom took his odyssey through the city of Dublin in 16th of June 1904 and recorded in the book Ulysses. We will be doing our annual reading of some sections of the book on Bloomsday. So just beware of this. Put it in your diaries, in your calendars. Next Friday, I'm going to be talking about, thank you, Philomena. Next Friday, the webinar will be me talking about the book Ulysses. I'm going to give you for those of you who do know the book, you can argue with me. And for those of you who don't know the book, it will be a little sort of introduction to the topic. The following Wednesday, am I right? Wednesday will be the 16th of June. And on that day, throughout the day, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, we will be reading 9 sections of the book, one section from from 9 different chapters, each hour on the hour. We'll have all the details about that in an email, which we'll be sending out to everybody on our list, so you have no excuse. You can listen to them all. You can listen to 1 or 2 of them. It is just like the webinars, completely free of charge. We're doing this as a celebration of one of Ireland's very greatest, if not the world's very greatest writers. So it's free. It's available. Please tune in next Friday to get an introduction, and the following Wednesday to actually hear the pieces. As I say, it is free, but every donation helps. Every few dollars you can send really does help. So do think about that. Check out the website. All the information will be there. You'll be getting emails. In the meantime, thank you again for being with us. I think that was fascinating listening there to Montez. Next week, James Joyce. Have a wonderful week. I'm now going to sit down and have the glass of wine I've been waiting for to celebrate my birthday. Thank you all. See you next time.